If a man who has taste enough to judge of the products of beautiful art with the greatest accuracy and refinement willingly leaves a chamber where are to be found those beauties that minister to vanity or to any social joys, and turns to the beautiful in nature in order to find, as it were, delight for his spirit in a train of thought that he can never completely evolve, we will regard this choice of his with veneration, and attribute to him a beautiful soul, to which no connoisseur or lover of art can lay claim on account of the interest he takes in his artistic objects. Immanuel Kant. I previously discussed what beauty is to Kant. How to him beauty is its own kind of pleasure, situated between the sense pleasure, the delight we take in the pleasant, and the intellectual pleasure, the approval we give to the good. A purely aesthetical, purely contemplative pleasure. And I discussed how the four moments of beauty that Kant describes are that when it comes to quantity, it has universality. When I find something beautiful, I judge that it doesn't just bring pleasure and joy to me, but rather that everyone should like it. The judgment is, when it comes to quality, it is a disinterested judgment, meaning that I don't want anything from the beautiful object. I don't want its reality. I don't want to use it in some way. I just enjoy the representation I have of it, the picture, so to say, that I have in my mind. When it comes to relation, the beautiful is that which is purposive, but without serving an actual purpose. It just has a form that is subjectively purposive, that is sort of lending itself to my faculty of cognition, to my power of imagination and my intellect, who get into a free play with it. And lastly, when it comes to modality, I said the beautiful is that which gives us pleasure by necessity. Not just depending on some interest we may or may not have, but rather insofar as we are humans, as we are intellectual but also sensual beings, we all must find pleasure in beauty, but only insofar as we are just humans. So only insofar as we can abstract from our individuality and our individual interests. Now, to Kant, there is a connection between the different parts of our mind. I talked about in previous lectures about how to Kant, the human mind or the human psyche has three parts: the faculty of cognition, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and the desiring faculty. And I also already mentioned that to Kant, the thinking faculty also has three parts. There is the intellect, then there is the power of judgment, and largely there is reason. And these three thinking faculties correspond to the three faculties of our mind. They give laws, so to say. They are constitutive for the three faculties of our mind: the intellect for the faculty of cognition, the power of judgment for the feeling of pleasure and displeasure when it comes to the beautiful, and reason for the desiring faculty. And I mentioned that to Kant, the power of judgment is sort of the bridge between the intellect and reason. And also that the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, for which, again, the power of judgment is constitutive, that also sort of forms a bridge between the faculty of cognition and the desiring faculty. And it is this bridge, in a way, that I want to talk about here. Because so far, I think I made it clear in the previous lecture on what is beauty, how, when it comes to the beautiful, the faculty of feeling pleasure and displeasure is connected to the faculty of cognition. Because we do find beautiful what our power of imagination and our intellect can play with, in a way. We do find beautiful that thing which in a way could easily be cognized, which has a form that makes us feel our faculty of cognition, that strengthens our faculty of cognition. But what about the other end of the bridge, the desiring faculty, and therefore morality? How is the beautiful connected to morality? Well, speaking in general terms, Kant would say that the beautiful can serve as a symbol for the morally good, which is how it was used in art, right? You might use beauty to depict goodness, like angels or saints. They usually tend to be depicted as beautiful. The Virgin Mary is depicted as beautiful because we seem to almost instinctively make this connection between beauty and morality. But the question is why? Well, Kant would say, speaking in general terms, morality is about lawfulness, about following the moral law and doing your duty. I will get more into that when I get to talk about Kant's moral philosophy soon. But here it should be enough to talk about this in general terms. So morality is about a certain lawfulness, and that means that as moral beings, or at least as beings whose vocation is morality, we have a sort of appreciation for lawfulness. And that is exactly what the beautiful is. In its purposiveness, it seems to have a lawful form. It seems to have a form that follows a rule, even though we cannot say which rule that might be. We cannot name that rule, we cannot describe the beautiful in concepts, but still it is not chaotic, it is not disproportionate, but rather it is proportionate, symmetric, orderly. We like it because of its rulefulness, and we like rulefulness because, well, that is what we are called to like, so to say, as moral beings. Likewise, as moral beings, we should treat other moral beings, other human beings, with regard, with reverence. That is, we should not subject them just to our interests, to our purposes, but rather treat them as a purpose or an end in itself. And that is sort of what we do when we find something beautiful. We don't subject it to our interests, to our desires, our goals, but we let it be in a way. And therefore, Kant would say that the mood of the person who appreciates beauty and the mood of the moral person, they have a certain analogy with one another, because both of them have, in a way, risen above their individuality, risen above their animality, risen above their sensual desires. Of course, there's still a difference. The moral person is not without interest. He does act with an interest, but his interest is a selfless one. his interest is not the interest of his sensual desires, it's not pathological interest, but rather it's the interest in doing what is right. And on the other hand, the person who appreciates beauty in that moment has no interest at all, not even a moral one. But he is similar to the moral person in that he too abstracted from his personal, his sensual, his pathological interests. Both of them are not this or that person with these or that desires, but rather both of them are just a human being in general. As a human being in general, I appreciate what has a beautiful form. As a human being in general, I do what is right. And both of them have a certain inner harmony. It's just that when it comes to beauty, the harmony is more on the side of the faculty of cognition. It is a harmony between our power of imagination and our intellect that are in a harmonious play with one another, while the moral person has a harmony in his faculty of desires, right? The immoral, the evil person is really at a disharmony with himself. Like, let's say there's a thief or a robber who breaks into other people's houses. Well, he himself doesn't want that to be the norm, right? He doesn't think that this is okay in general. He himself probably wants this to be forbidden. Because otherwise, while he is out breaking into someone else's house, someone could be breaking into his house. And clearly he doesn't want that. So really, in a way, he's at odds with himself. While the good person who does unto others what he wants them to do too, has a harmony in his will. So both have a similar mood. Both have an inner harmony, and both have risen above their sensual animal part. And therefore, Kant says that taste, so the taste of reflection, the taste for beauty, could also be described as the faculty of sensualizing moral ideas. So in a way, the beautiful can be taken as the appearance of what is moral, what is good. Because actual morality is supersensual. It's not something I can see or touch or hear. It is something I can only think. It is, again, if this doesn't make sense completely, that's fine for now. I will explain it further when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. But it is as if there is an invisible realm of purposes, of freedom. A realm in which every rational being, every free being is a citizen, and in which we ought to act freely, but act in a way that we don't subject others and make them objects that serve our purposes, but rather in a way that we regard, that we have reverence for them as a purpose, as an end in itself. And if everyone did this, if everyone was good, holy even, there would be a harmony, right? In this invisible moral realm of purposes, there would be a harmony. There would be a sort of paradise created. And the beautiful is making this harmony visible, sort of, so to say, right? So if you imagine something beautiful, like a beautiful meadow with flowers and so on, when you look at it, you like it, you take a liking to it, because there is a certain harmony of nature displayed there. There is a certain order, a certain purposive form in that manifoldness, in this multitude of impressions you get there. And this is, of course, not the same, but it is as a sort of analogy of the order that should reign in the moral realm, that should reign in the realm of purposes in which rational beings act. So this realm is invisible, it can't be seen, but if it could be seen, it would look like this beautiful meadow with flowers. That is basically what we are saying when we find something beautiful. Again, this is exactly why we tend to depict the moral, if we try to depict it, as beautiful, why we depict angels, for example, as beautiful people. The beautiful is liked because in its form, it displays the same harmony in appearance in the sensual that morality should bring into the things themselves, into the supersensual. Which is also the reason why liking beauty is necessary for a being such as we are, for a being which has a vocation towards morality. So much about the general connection between the beautiful and the moral. I now want to get into two more specific points. The first is the ideal of beauty, because Kant says we do have such a thing as human beings. We have an ideal of what the beautiful should look like. And let me remind you what that means, what an ideal means to Kant. I talked about this more extensively in the lecture on what is reason. Because reason is the faculty of ideas, and ideas to Kant are not just random things you come up with, like the word is now used in everyday language, but rather the idea is a concept of reason, of an absolute, of a maximum, which for that very reason can never appear to us in experience. And the ideal was that idea imagined as realized in a concrete individual. So I can have the idea of justice, and I can have the ideal of the perfect state, the rational state, the state of reason, the perfectly just state. So I imagine the idea of justice being realized in one particular state. Or I can have the idea of the good, and I can have the ideal of the moral person or the holy person, like Jesus maybe. So I imagine the general idea of goodness realized in one human being who is completely good. Likewise, I can imagine the idea of wisdom realized in the sage, so in a truly wise human being. And in the same way, Kant would say there is an idea of beauty we have, and of that idea we can have an ideal. So we can imagine a particular thing being truly and completely beautiful. Not the slightest imperfection, perfect beauty. Again, of course, we will never experience such a thing. Like all ideas and all ideals which come from the ideas, this is something that we can think of. This is something we can have a representation of, but it is not something that can ever appear to us. But still, we do have such an ideal. The thing is just that Kant says it is an ideal of the power of imagination. That is what is special here, because as I said here, and as I said in the lecture on reason, usually it is reason which is the faculty of ideas, and therefore from which also the ideals come, being just realized ideas. But in this particular case, Kant says, we are dealing not with an ideal of reason, but of the power of imagination, because reason is still discursive. So it is still part of the thinking faculty. And it is still discursive, means it is conceptual. It is thinking in concepts, in general representations. That is what ideas are. They are just a sort of higher concepts. But this ideal of beauty, unlike other ideals, is not based on a concept, Kant says. We cannot describe what rules it follows. Like the perfectly, like I should be able to define what justice is, and then I should be able to describe what the perfectly just state is. So I could say that the just state would treat everyone equal, for example. There would be no slavery, there would be no apartheid in a perfectly just state. Or I can describe what goodness is, and therefore I can describe what the ideal of the holy person would entail. I can have a concept of that. I could say the holy person will not act selfishly. He will not throw others under the bus for his own desires getting fulfilled or whatever. But when it comes to the ideal of beauty, just like beauty in general, it is not something I can describe in concepts. It is not something I can give a rule for. I cannot say, oh, the perfectly beautiful human being will look exactly like this. So it is not an ideal of reason, it is an ideal of the power of imagination. I can sort of imagine it, and I can say, I would know if I saw it. Like if I saw a perfectly beautiful person, I could say, oh, this person is very, very beautiful. But I cannot necessarily describe what it entails. It is, so to say, not a discursive, but an intuitive ideal. But still, it is an ideal, and it serves the same function as all ideals do. And I talked about that in the lecture on what is reason, and also in the lecture on the result of the critique of pure reason and on reason's regulative function. The ideals to Kant have two functions. For one, they let us judge what is there. So I can judge a particular state or a particular person by comparing it to my ideal. And then I can say this state is somewhat just. It's not perfect. It's not the ideal state. It's not some utopia, but it's somewhat just. And this other state is further from the ideal. It's an unjust state. And likewise, when it comes to people, I can say this person is generally a good person, maybe not holy, but he's closer to the ideal, and this other person is further away from the ideal. He's sort of an asshole. Well, and the same is true for the ideal of beauty, Kant would say. By this ideal, I can make judgments. I can say, this person is not so beautiful, this person is sort of ugly, and I can say this person, while not being completely ideal, comes closer to the ideal of what a beautiful person should look like. But also, the second function of ideals is they don't just let us judge what is already there, they let us produce new things. As Kant says, the idea is an archetype by which I can act. So I can try to make the existing states in the world more just. I can try to create the perfectly just state. or I can try to act according to the ideal of the holy person to be good and holy myself. Like there are these Christians, for example, that have this phrase, "What would Jesus do?" And really, what they are asking is, what would a completely holy person do? Because I mean, this is not so much about what would the historical Jesus of Nazareth do. It's not like they could know. It's not like they could truly know if that historical Jesus was a holy person or not either. And I mean, the only situations where we could know what Jesus would do is if we were in exactly the same situation as Jesus is in the Bible, right? So if I go into a house of God and I see moneylenders there, then I know what Jesus would do. He would drive them out. But in most situations I get into in my life, they are not the exact same situations as Jesus gets into in the Bible. So in that way, I don't know what the historical Jesus would do. I mean, of course, it's not like the Bible actually at all times describes what the historical Jesus has done and is historically accurate, but let's put that aside. So really, what these people are asking is, what would a holy person do? So they are not really asking about Jesus as such, rather they are asking their own reason, whether they realize it or not. They have an idea in their head, so to say, of what is good, and therefore what a holy person would behave like. And they are not simply following the historical Jesus, they are following this idea. But that is exactly the purpose an ideal serves. And the same is true for the ideal of beauty, Kant would say. It doesn't just let us judge what is or is not beautiful, it lets us create the beautiful. So if you have a stonemason or a painter who want to create a beautiful statue or a beautiful painting, they will not just depict people as they actually are, because the actual people are not perfectly beautiful. They all have some flaws, but rather they will look inside and they will let their own ideal of what a beautiful human being should look like, they will let that ideal guide them, and they will try to create an ideal statue or an ideal painting. But what is our ideal of the beautiful? What does it entail? Well, Kant says, even though it is an ideal of the power of imagination, not of reason, and therefore not based on a concept, it must still contain a concept of the object. Because otherwise it would just be vague, which as an ideal it cannot be. As an ideal, it must in a way be something fixated, something steady. And that is why Kant says there can only be an ideal of beauty when it comes to applied aesthetical judgments, not to pure aesthetical judgments. I talked about that difference in my lecture on what is beauty. Basically, a pure aesthetical judgment is when I truly judge only the beauty of a thing. I make a completely disinterested judgment, which is not based on concepts of what is that thing I'm seeing, and what is the purpose of that thing, but rather which is completely disinterested, completely without concept, just judging the form of that thing. Such a judgment, such a pure aesthetical judgment, Kant says there cannot be an ideal. So let's take, for example, the beauty of a sunset. Since we don't have a concept of what a sunset should be, I mean, a sunset shouldn't be anything. It has no purpose as far as we know of. We can, of course, scientifically explain why it happens, but we cannot explain what it happens for. It happens for nothing. It just happens to happen, so to say. And that is exactly why there can't be an ideal of a beautiful sunset. There can be different sunsets which look very different, but we could still find them equally beautiful, because we don't have one specific ideal of what a sunset should look like. When we have an ideal of something, there cannot be a multiplicity. For example, going back to the state, I have one specific ideal of a just state. There could be several states, but unless they have exactly the same laws and work in the exact same way, I am probably going to judge that one of them is in a way more just than the other. So they won't be equal to me. But when it comes to sunsets, I could probably find two very different sunsets to be equally beautiful in their own way. And that is because here I have no ideal of how the sunset should be. So an ideal of beauty can only happen when I make applied aesthetical judgment. So one that is not purely aesthetical. And of course, here by applied judgment, I don't mean an aesthetical judgment where sense pleasure is mixed in, where I find something beautiful but also pleasant, because that is not based on concepts. That's just based on my senses, on my sensuality. So here too, there can be no ideal. No, it must be an aesthetical judgment where a sort of intellectual pleasure is mixed in. So where I have a concept of that object I'm judging and of its purpose, of what it is supposed to be. And it must meet that purpose. Of course, it must do more than that. It must also be beautiful in its form on top of that. But being made in a way that it fulfills its purpose is a condition of me finding it beautiful. But even here, Kant says, even when it comes to these applied aesthetical judgments, we don't have an ideal of beauty when it comes to all the things, but just when it comes to human beings. And that is because only when it comes to human beings do we really know their purpose. Their purpose is morality. Their purpose is being good. When it comes to other beings in the world, we don't know what they are there for. So, for example, let's say I'm judging the beauty of a horse. Kant would say, of course, we can give a purpose to a horse. I can say the horse is there to be ridden. Or I can say the horse exists to draw a cart. And depending on what purpose I give to that horse, I will probably want the horse to be this way or to be that way. Like if I want the horse to draw a cart, I want it to be strong maybe. If I want to ride it, maybe I want it to be swift. But really all of these purposes are purposes I give to that horse. I'm now saying the horse exists for me, to carry me or to draw my cart. But what the horse as such, independently of me, is there for. So why horses exist at all? what their purpose is, what the meaning of the life of the horse is. Why, if you want to believe in a creator, why God made that horse. I don't know that. And I can't know that. The only thing of which I can know its purpose that it has in itself, not just the purpose I give to it, the purpose it serves for me, but rather what its own purpose is myself, is the human being. Because I know I have a moral duty. I know my purpose in life is to be a moral person. Again, I will explain that further when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. For now, you will just sort of have to accept that. So therefore, Kant would say, only when it comes to human beings, we have a true ideal of beauty. We don't necessarily have an ideal of what a beautiful horse should look like, or what a beautiful flower should look like, but we all have an ideal of what a beautiful human being should look like. And this ideal, in turn, is made up of two parts. The first component is what Kant calls the aesthetical normal idea. That is an idea of our power of imagination. So, again, usually it's reason which is the faculty of ideas, but this particular idea belongs to our power of imagination, and it is basically an image we have of what a human being, a normal, regular human being, should look like. So basically the standard image of a human being. So if you ask someone, draw a human being, don't draw this or that particular human, but just draw a human, it is likely that this person will draw something according to his normal idea of a human being. Like, for example, it is likely that he will draw a person with 2 arms. Surely he knows that there are some human beings who lost an arm, but this is not normal. This is not what a normal human being, according to our idea, should look like. And also, when you tell someone, draw a human being, likely he won't draw a fat person. Of course, we know that there are some people that are so fat they can't even walk, but we understand that this is not the norm. We have a certain normal idea of how a human being should look like. Basically, you can imagine if nature was an artist, then the normal idea would be sort of the idea that this artist works by. And you could say that every actual human being is nature trying to depict that idea, and always failing to a degree. Sometimes more so, sometimes less so. But of course, no one actually is exactly like that normal idea. One person is a little larger or a little smaller, a little thinner, a little thicker. Someone has slightly thicker eyebrows, or slightly darker or slightly more pale skin. But it is as if nature had this idea of what a human being should look like, and was constantly trying to create humans according to this idea. Or you can also imagine this normal idea is sort of the opposite of a caricature. Because in caricature, you try to emphasize that which is characteristic about a person, right? So if someone has a slightly longer neck, the caricaturist may depict him with a very long neck, like a giraffe. Or if someone is a little sick, or if someone has a slightly crooked nose, then the caricature might depict him with a huge beak of a nose. So the caricature emphasizes what is characteristic, in a specific person, but the aesthetical normal idea is not characteristic and not specific. It takes away everything characteristic and only leaves what is normal. It is basically human beings as you would find them depicted in, let's say, an anatomy book, right? There you will have drawings of a human, and that human will look normal. He will not be particularly skinny or particularly fat or whatever. He will just have the normal look of a human being. And this is an idea because, like all ideas, it depicts a sort of maximum, a totality, the totally normal human being. And like all ideas, it can, for that very reason, never appear in experience. So, just like actual justice or actual goodness in its absoluteness cannot appear in experience, so the normal human body in its absoluteness cannot appear in appearance. We can only say that some things that appear to us come closer to our idea and some are further away from our idea, but the actual idea can never appear to us in sensuality. So that's why Kant would call it an idea, even though it comes not from reason, because it's not a concept, right? It is an image, so it comes from our imagination. And Kant would say that this aesthetical normal idea is one component of our ideal of beauty. So, in order for us to find a person beautiful, he should be close to that aesthetical normal idea. If someone is too different from that idea, like for example, too fat or too skinny, or has too thick lips or too thick eyebrows or a too crooked nose or whatever, we don't find that beautiful anymore. Which is not to say, however, that the other way around, it is enough to be like this normal idea to already be beautiful. If that were the case, then we would find the depictions in an anatomy book beautiful. But no, this is just enough to not be ugly, but it doesn't truly make you beautiful. You can see that when you ask AI to, if you feed it with images of many, many human faces, and then you make it sort of combine them into one standard face, these artificially created faces, they may not be ugly. There may not be anything wrong with them. They are not distorted or anything. They are not grotesque, but still they lack a certain character. They are not truly beautiful, but rather a little boring. So we need more. But before I get to that more, before I get to that second component, let's stay with this normal idea and ask, where do we get it from? Well, here Kant says we are not just born with the idea of what a human being should look like, but rather we experience what human beings actually look like. And our power of imagination sort of, just as I described the computer, the AI doing, it sort of combines the images of human beings that we experience in life. It sort of combines them into one. So I may meet some people that are a bit taller, and I may meet some people who are more petite, and I combine these images and I arrive at what is the standard height that a human being should have. Or I meet some people that are a bit on the skinny side, and I meet others that may be very fat, and I combine all of these images into the image of a human being who has the average weight, so to say. This is also why, according to Kant, why the ancient Greeks were so great at creating beautiful statues of human beings. He says that they had lots of chances to see the human body and to see it completely naked, because they would do their sports naked, their gymnastics. That's actually where the word comes from. Gymnos means naked. That's where we take the word gym from, because they were doing sports naked. They were doing their competitions naked. So Kant says they saw a lot of naked bodies, and therefore they could arrive at an aesthetical normal idea of the human body, while people living in a society like his, where everyone is constantly dressed and you basically almost never get to see others naked, maybe yourself, maybe your wife, but just a handful of people, not enough to form a real normal idea of what a human body should look like. You have a harder time really, so to say, getting a grasp on the human form. At least that's Kant's explanation for why the ancient Greeks created such beautiful statues. We can be somewhat critical of that explanation, but even so, it doesn't take away from what he says about this normal idea. I think if you think about it, it is quite interesting if you think about what follows from that. Because what follows is that there is not the one normal idea of what a human being should look like. And therefore, since this makes one component of the ideal of beauty, there is no one ideal of beauty. But rather, it really depends on your surroundings. It depends in what society you grow up. If you grow up amongst the people where everyone is tall, then even if someone has what is average height for a human being, in this people, that person might be small. And therefore, maybe you will find him less beautiful, because you will think, oh, he's a bit too small for a human being. He should be a bit taller. But that same person could maybe go to some other people, some other tribe, where everyone is on the smaller side, and be considered very huge. And likewise, when it comes to something like skin color, and Kant actually says that. He says, sure, we Europeans, our normal idea of what a human being is will be a white person. But if you go into Africa, of course, all of this is somewhat less true nowadays, because the whole world is connected and we have the internet and we can see people from everywhere. So I would still argue that the immediate surroundings in which a child grows up still have a huge influence. But I mean, back then, if you went to many Africans, they probably had never seen a single white person. So clearly, their normal idea of what a human being looks like would not have included white skin, but would have included black skin, because their idea would be formed by sort of taking the average of all the people they know, and all the people they knew would have been black people, of course. So therefore, Kant says different regions of the world, different peoples, will have a different normal idea. And again, you can test this by asking someone, draw a human being. If you ask someone, like, ask a child. If you ask a child in Europe, let's say, draw a human being, the child will probably, without thinking, draw a white person. But if you ask a child somewhere in Africa, draw a human being, maybe that child, again, without thinking, will draw a black person. Because even if they already know that there are people with other skin colors, this is not normal to them. So if you don't explicitly tell the European child, draw a black person, but just say draw a human, then maybe that child will draw a white person, because that is his normal idea of what a human looks like. But that also means that the ideal of beauty depends, at least one half of it depends, on our surroundings, on what human beings we have experienced and grown up with. And therefore, there is no one ideal of beauty. And again, Kant says as much. He says that we Europeans might find the black skin or the features of a black person, the larger nose or the larger lips, we might find them less beautiful, Kant says, but they will probably find us less beautiful. And that is already quite aufklärt, because in that time, in the 18th century, I mean, of course, it still exists, but back then it was quite normal. There absolutely was such a thing as aesthetical racism. So let's put other forms of racism aside. But they didn't just say that, oh, black people are more stupid or whatever. They also said they are more ugly. The white person is the most ideal human being, the most beautiful human being. And what Kant is saying is that maybe the white person is the most beautiful human being to the white person. But to the black person is probably the most beautiful human being. And to the Asian person is probably the most beautiful human being. So when Kant gets accused of racism, which he does sometimes today, and I will talk more about his thoughts on race when I get to Kant's thoughts on natural philosophy and on biology. But whatever else he may or may not be accused of, we cannot really accuse him of aesthetical racism. This is certainly something in which he was already more aufklärt than his time, realizing that our surroundings influence what we consider normal and what we consider beautiful. And that is part of what being aufklärt means. I already mentioned that in a previous lecture, that the unaufklärt have this tendency to, when they meet something they don't know, they meet something that is different, that is new, their tendency is to always say, this is lesser, this is wrong somehow. For example, this is ugly. Oh, people look different from the people I know. That means they look ugly. While Aufklärung is about realizing that something different, something strange, is maybe just that, just different, but not necessarily worse in any way. I also think, by the way, that this explanation of the normal idea Kant gives explains certain issues that arise nowadays, where we have a mixing, a global mixing, but also in specific countries, of different humans who look differently. So one problem, for example, we have nowadays is that many who don't perfectly fit a certain standard of beauty, they may find themselves less beautiful. This is a big problem, for example, in many teenage girls, right? And what you can see here is in a country like the USA, where you have quite a number of black people, but still the norm that is depicted by the media is probably the white person. You will find young black girls thinking they are not beautiful, thinking that, for example, their more curly hair is not beautiful, and feeling like they have to straighten it to be more beautiful, to be, well, more white looking. And I think what is happening here is that, sure, they themselves may be black, but they are still surrounded by a largely white society. They still in the media see largely white actresses, white models, or whatever, depicted as the norm, as the standard, and that gives them a certain normal idea, and their normal idea of the human being is probably a white person, and not, as they themselves are, a black person. And therefore, being black people, they will of course be quite different from their own normal idea of what a human being should look like, and they may then suffer from that. They may then, for that reason, feel less beautiful, even though in other places or at other times they might have been considered perfectly normal and perfectly beautiful. Like, I don't think that in past centuries, when some girl in somewhere in Africa, when they didn't even know about white people, when they had never met white people, that some girl there felt like she had to straighten her hair, like her curly hair was not beautiful. She probably didn't have those thoughts because she only knew people with curly hair and not with straight hair. So to her, that was her idea of a normal human being. But anyway, so this is the normal idea, and Kant doesn't quite outright say it, but I would say that such a normal idea would exist not just of humans, but of everything, right? So if the normal idea is created by me seeing several human beings and my power of imagination sort of combining them and sort of creating an image of the average human being, well, I could do the same with, let's say, horses or dogs or roses or whatever. So I probably also have a normal idea of what a horse or what a flower looks like. And again, you could ask someone to draw such a thing, and he would probably draw something according to his normal idea, right? So if you ask someone draw a tree, I think it's less likely, at least here in Europe, that he would draw a palm tree. Like, we know that these exist and that they are also trees, but our normal idea of a tree is probably something else. But the ideal of beauty also has a second part. And it is this second part which is exclusive, which can only, well, happen when it comes to human beings, which is the reason why we only have an ideal of beauty when it comes to human beings. Because I think a normal idea of what a certain specimen is supposed to look like is something we can have of anything. Because the second component, as I already said, is our concept of what a human being is supposed to be. Not just supposed to look like, but supposed to be. And a human being is supposed to be good. So we can only find someone truly beautiful if he looks like he is meeting his purpose, like he is a good person. It is not enough to just fit our normal idea of what the species of human beings looks like. So that is a condition for beauty, but rather someone also must fit what our reason thinks the purpose of humanity is. So in, let's say, the face of a person, there must be expressed a certain spirit in order for that person to be beautiful. And that spirit must be the spirit of morality, of goodness. There must be something like calmness, friendliness, generosity, expressed in that face in order for us to find it beautiful. I think Fichte said it best when at some point he says, "The source of beauty is in God alone, and it reveals itself only in the minds of those who are inspired by him. Imagine, for example, a holy virgin who, being ascended into heaven, encircled by the heavenly hosts, who fall down before her presence in rapt contemplation, surrounded by all the splendors of a heaven of which she is herself the highest ornament and glory, can yet, alone of those present, see nothing of all that takes place around her, being wholly overwhelmed and lost in this one feeling. Behold the handmaiden of the Lord, be it unto me according to his will. Close this feeling, thus surrounded in a human body, and then unquestionably you have beauty in a determinate form. Now what is it that makes this form beautiful? Is it the separate parts and members of which it is composed? Is it not much rather the single feeling which speaks in all these members? The form is superadded, only because in it and by means of it the thought becomes visible, and it is transferred by means of lines and colors to the canvas, because thus only can it be communicated to others. Perhaps this thought might also have been expressed in hard and senseless stone, or in any other material. You can reflect on that yourself. What makes a person ugly? Apart from not fitting the normal idea of how a person should look like. So apart from being deformed, apart from having a hunchback or whatever, what makes a person ugly clearly is having an ugly soul, and that being somehow expressed in that face. Like if a person looks bitter, hateful, resentful, if a person looks dishonest, has dishonest eyes, if a person looks greedy, then we cannot find that person beautiful. Even if that person fits the normal idea. Even if that person is maybe attractive. Because as I said in the lecture on beauty, attractiveness and beauty are two entirely different things. So I would add that at least someone who's more aufklärt will have little interest in getting sexually intimate with someone who is evil, no matter how attractively their body might be shaped. There will probably be less attraction. But still, it is not the same. Someone could be attractive, someone could conform to the normal idea of the shape of a human body, but still, if his face looks somehow evil, if there is vice in one way or another expressed in that face, we cannot find that person beautiful. I mean, imagine, like, for example, a Trump rally. Imagine all these Make America Great Again people. When you see these pictures of them in their rage, in their hate, their faces contorted in hate, I'm not doubting that there are some amongst them who may be considered attractive, who may fit the normal idea of beauty. In fact, there are some amongst the right who use that for propaganda purposes, right? I mean, for example, there are these right-wing female influencers, these thread wives. It's sort of the whole shtick that, oh, look at me, I'm the perfect blonde and blue-eyed, attractive, thin Aryan housewife. So I'm not saying that these people are all grotesquely deformed or something, but still, you can't really find them beautiful. There's something so cold in their eyes, something so resentful. And when you see them at such a rally, where they are also excited in a way, where they are screaming and looking angry, these people just don't look beautiful. They look repulsive. And Kant even says that this is way more important than fitting the normal idea. It says that even a deformed, even a grotesque face is something that can become dear to you. Maybe you get to know a person who is somehow deformed because of a disability or because of an incident or whatever. And when you get to know that person, and when you get to like that person, even that deformed face will become likable to you. Even that deformed face will be something that becomes dear to you, Kant says. But on the other hand, if a face seems to express vice, if a face seems to express evilness, there's no way it can ever become dear to us. There's no way we can ever enjoy looking at us. This is, for example, why I can barely watch the news, because all of our politicians, no matter if it's here in Germany or in the world in general, I can't look at their faces. They repulse me. Because they are generally so despicable people, and it shows. It really shows. And on the other hand, if you try to reflect about what we find beautiful, again, apart from fitting the normal idea, apart from having a symmetrical, a non-deformed face and so on, what we will find beautiful is a certain expression of calmness, of inner peace, of joy, of generosity, of wisdom, of courage in the face. Being an Aufklärer, therefore, sometimes getting to watch people that I helped becoming more aufklärt, I got to see the difference. I got to see people who didn't change body-wise. Like, it's not as if they got somehow plastic surgery and changed their face, but still, as people become more aufklärt, they usually become more beautiful. It is as if a shadow is lifted from their face. It is as if their face is now lighting up in a way. It is as if there's a spark in their eyes that starts glowing. And this is what the ideal of beauty is based on. And I find this interesting also because there's a sort of discussion going on throughout the ages about the connection between beauty and morality. They used, in older times, there used to be this belief that the beautiful is moral, that a person's looks sort of reflect that person's soul. So a good person would be beautiful, and if someone was beautiful, if someone was fair of skin and hair and so on, that would show that that person is a good person. And on the other hand, if someone was ugly, that would show an ugly soul. So you might have the villains depicted as ugly people, as somehow deformed people, somehow grotesque looking people, having a hunchback, having warts or whatever. And I mean, this was a more prominent belief in older times. But even in more recent times, you still often have had villains depicted as ugly. Not just in stories, also in propaganda. I mean, just look at the Nazi propaganda, which depicted the Germans, the Aryans, as beautiful, ideal people, and which claimed that the Jews are not just ugly on the inside, that they are not just greedy and conspiring against the Aryans, but also which depicted them as ugly on the outside. But on the other hand, we nowadays tend to fall into the other extreme and tend to claim, oh, you can't judge a person by their looks. and the way a person looks says nothing about that person's character. So nowadays we tend to treat, or at least demand, that it be treated as completely disconnected, the way a person looks and the way a person is when it comes to morality. And this, I would say, is also wrong and naive, because you can judge a person by how he looks. But of course, not by things that that person cannot influence. So, sure, if someone has a hunchback, that doesn't prove that they are evil, of course not. And or the hair color, of course, blonde people are not somehow morally better than dark-haired people or whatever. But the way a person looks, the way a person carries himself, does say something about that person's character. The character expresses itself in a person's facial features, the person's expressions, and also not just in the face, maybe there it's most obvious, but also in the posture of that person's body, in that person's movements. I mean, that's something I learned early on from my dad as a physiotherapist and as an expert of movement. That, of course, by the way someone moves, you can judge that person's character to a degree. Someone moves the same way as he thinks. So if someone is a person that is easily scared, a person who is ruled by fear, then he will have the posture of a fearful person. He will have a shy posture. He will be sort of sunk into himself. And on the other hand, if someone has courage and approaches life with courage and joy, he will have a more open, a more wide breast. One person may move more gracefully and another person may be more stiff, because that is maybe also how they think. So I think in this discussion, is beauty, can it be equated with goodness or not? It is best to employ Kant's sympathetic method, about which I already talked in another lecture. That method, which is based on Kant's belief that there is no complete error, there's only partial error, and therefore, when we have two sides of an argument, we should find the partial truths of both sides and combine them into a sort of better middle position. And that is, I think, exactly what we can do here, based on Kant's theory of the ideal of beauty. We can say that in this discussion, both sides make the error of not completely distinguishing, as they should, between the normal idea of the power of imagination and between reason's idea of the purpose of the human being. Because when it comes to the former, we can say it has nothing to do with morality. Someone could fit the normal idea of our power of imagination, of what a human being should look like, and be completely evil. And someone could not fit that idea at all. Someone could be very deformed and be a very good person. But when it comes to the other side of the ideal of beauty, then yes, there is a connection between beauty and goodness, and between ugliness and evilness. So much so that even a deformed person can look more beautiful if he looks like a good person. And even an outwardly attractive person can look utterly repulsive if he looks evil. And no one can look truly beautiful, maybe attractive but not beautiful, but rather they will look ugly if there is evilness, if there's hatred or dishonesty or whatever in their face. But with that, I'm done talking about the ideal of beauty and what it is according to Kant and how it is connected to morality. And so I want to turn to the second part of this lecture, which is maybe the more important part, because after everything I said here in this lecture and in the previous lectures, you could say that, okay, maybe Kant's theory of beauty is correct, and maybe it's even interesting to hear about that and reflect about that, but ultimately it doesn't matter much, right? Life would go on like before. And I already alluded to it that I think this is how many academics nowadays indeed see this theory of beauty. Because, at least in some circles, it's more accepted still than other parts of Kant's theory. I've met people who would say that Kant's theory of cognition or his theory of morality, that is wrong and that's in the past, we left that behind, we know better now, but who still find merit in his theory of beauty. Now, I already said that this is quite inconsistent and just shows that these people have not understood Kant, because his theory of beauty is entirely based on his theory of cognition. So you really can't accept one if you don't accept the other. But that aside, if you ask why is it that this is accepted when other parts of Kant's philosophy are not, I would say it is because people think it's more harmless. Like, they think they can accept it and it doesn't really matter. I mean, when it comes to Kant's moral philosophy, you cannot really accept it without following it, right? You cannot say Kant is right about what is moral and what isn't moral without at the same time trying to live according to it. Because if you did that, you would have to judge yourself to be a hypocrite, and your own conscience would tell you that you should act differently. So if you don't want to follow Kant's moral demands and don't want to feel bad about not following them, your only choice really is to reject them, to say that Kant was wrong with his theory. But when it comes to Kant's theory of beauty, it seems to people as if they can accept it and really it doesn't matter for their lives. But I would argue that it does, that the theory is of importance, and maybe more so nowadays in our day than it was in Kant's time. Because nowadays we live in a time where we exploit and destroy nature, and thereby the very fundament of our own civilization, the very conditions of our own life, to a degree which Kant could never have imagined. Nature nowadays is treated by us as something that exists solely for us, that can be used by us, that can be consumed by us. And the only sort of reason people know is what Kant would call technical practical reason. Or maybe it's more catchy to go with the term Horkheimer later coined and to call it the instrumental reason. So we use reason as an instrument to reach our goals, but those goals themselves, they are not rational. They are the opposite. They are the goals that our animal side has. They are goals set to us by nature, set by our desires, by our drives. And reason is just taken to be a tool, an instrument to reach those goals. But not, as Kant envisioned it, that which would be actual wisdom. Reason is not the faculty that sets the goals, that tells us not just how to get there, but where to get. So that means that when it comes to pleasure, the only pleasure that people often know and often are focused on is the sense pleasure. They don't know the aesthetical pleasure of the beautiful. They don't know the intellectual pleasure of the moral good. If anything, they know the intellectual pleasure of the mediate good, the pleasure that is approval of that which is good for something, which is useful. But that in the end leads back to sense pleasure, right? So I might be happy about money, but in the end, that is because with the money, I can get gratification in some sensual way. And when we look at the world that way, we objectify that world and we subjugate that world to us, which is exactly the opposite as the eye of the person who appreciates beauty does. Here we don't let the object be free, right? If a farmer looks at his sheep and he doesn't enjoy seeing it because it is beautiful, but because it has lots of wool which he will be able to sell, or because it is fat and can therefore be killed, and he can sell or eat himself the meat. Then with his gaze and with the pleasure he takes in what he sees, he's basically saying, you, sheep, don't exist for yourself. You exist solely for me and for what you can bring to me. You exist for my interests. I force you to submit to my interests. And if we treat other humans that way, that is utter disregard. In the lecture on beauty, I talked about people, about my former classmates who cannot appreciate beauty because they cannot rise above their self-interests, about their sensual desires. And I mentioned this former classmate who would call a girl over who had a crush on him, take her virginity, then lie that his parents would soon come home and send her away and ghost her. This is exactly the attitude I'm talking about. If I just care about my own sensual pleasure, then that which brings me that pleasure is just an object for my pleasure. Even another human being is then reduced to a mere sex toy. And it is never about that specific human being then. Because it is just about my pleasure, anyone would do. I could take this girl, I could take another girl as long as she's equally attractive to me. It doesn't matter much. Because other people, even other people and also nature, are just objects for my pleasure then. But what we should also realize, and what usually isn't realized or isn't emphasized enough, is that such people are not just objectifying others, they are also objectifying themselves. Which is exactly why the usual feminist complaints about such guys, such as this classmate of mine, they are too superficial. They don't go to the actual root of the issue. Of course they are right when they are saying he's objectifying women and the way he treats them is not right. But when they reduce it to some war of the sexes and to men being somehow sexist or whatever, that does not go deep enough. Because we should realize that such a person also turns himself into an object. Other people are just there for his gratification, but so is he. His own body becomes his own sex toy. He is just basically treating himself as a sort of pleasure generator who only exists to create more pleasure in life. And we need to realize such people are driven by their own desires. They are not free. They are the slaves of their desires. It's not them who decide to act this way. And it's not them who decide to treat others badly. But rather it's their desires forcing them to do it. By which I don't want to excuse them. When I'm saying forcing them, I don't want to say, oh, it's not their own fault. They can't do it in any other way. No, of course not. They chose to submit to their desires and to be driven by their desires. They could choose to be different. They could choose to act as rational as free beings. I will get more into that when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. But what I am saying is that as they are now, they are not free. I mean, drive comes from being driven. They are driven by their drives. They are unfree. And if they would just reflect, but of course, unaufkläred people don't reflect, they don't stop in their tracks, they are not self-critical. But if they would reflect, they would realize that they are extremely unhappy. There are those people who are super stressed with their work. And still, some of them can't stop working. They are workaholics who have to keep working even though they don't know what for. Or they are obsessed maybe with their career. And they don't aspire for a higher position, let's say, in their company, for any specific goal. Like, it's not like they need to make more money or they need this position so they can have a positive impact of some sorts. No, the career becomes a goal in itself. I must advance. Why? If I'm fine in the position I'm in, why do I need to get to a higher position? Or these people obsess over their looks. How many people are unhappy with their looks? How many people try very hard to change their looks, maybe even undergo plastic surgery, which means paying tons of money for something completely useless. Which means, I mean, if you have that much money to spare and you pay it for that, you must be an evil person. You must be a selfish person. Because otherwise, since you seem to not need this money for your food or for your rent or something actually important, why didn't you give that money away to someone who actually needs it? I mean, you could always donate that money to a good cause. But no, you had to invest it into your nose or into your boobs or whatever. Because you disregard yourself so much. So here too we see it. It's a disregard for others, because I spent this money which I apparently could have spent on them. I rather spent it on myself, but it's also a disregard on myself. I reduce myself to this object which needs to fit some standard of attractiveness, and I make myself believe that I'm not worthy, I have no value if I don't fit this standard. As if the value of a human being is dependent on that. It's quite the opposite. If I throw my dignity away like that, that means losing my value. I gain in value if I say something silly like, how big are my boobs? Doesn't matter, doesn't define my value. If I say that, that gives me value. Or people who are obsessed with brands, with status symbols. People who need to drive a big car or to have certain clothes from a certain brand, who need to go on vacation in this specific place, who need to go to Dubai. Again, it's clearly a disregard for others. I'm exploiting others. The clothes, the cars, the living in Dubai, all of that depends on slavery. All of that also ruins the climate for everyone. But also, it's clearly a disregard for myself. I mean, those people are definitely not happy. They may pretend on their Instagrams where they pose, where they post these perfect pictures. But we all really know that they are not. We all really know that even if they don't reflect enough to realize it, they hate their lives. Or look at the people who easily get triggered by something, who easily get angry. There are people, grown up people, who get angry over the most stupid, most banal things. I have a friend who worked in customer service of an online shop, and the people who call there, often old people, often people who have lived all their lives, and you would expect that they had time to grow up, to become adults, but no. They get angry over the silliest bullshit, like some garden gnome they ordered not being there in time or whatever. And also in people's social interactions. Like, you have people who could have a perfect life, a perfect relationship and marriage with their partner, but no, then the girl has to have a very, very expensive ring when they marry, with a very, very expensive diamond. Apparently, her whole happiness and her whole relationship depends on that. And if the guy doesn't spend several $1,000s on that, apparently he doesn't love her. I mean, people don't realize how, with these silly desires, which rule them and which enslave them, they create their own unhappiness, which they wouldn't need to feel if they were just more rational, if they were just more independent of these drives. But all of that is driven by what is probably the most unaufklärt word there is, the word must. People will say, I must work hard. I must advance my career. I must have the diamond ring. I must get angry now. They will always, must means you are not free. They will always throw their freedom away. They will always claim to be victims and act as if what they are doing right now, what they are desiring right now, it has to be that way. It can't be any other way. They have no other choice. And of course, that is not just the case in on the individual level, but also on higher, on social, on state levels, where we say we must reject the refugees. We must do deals and trading with despotic countries like China or the Arab countries or whatever. We must keep ruining the climate, because if we change, that would somehow ruin our economy, and then we would not have growth anymore, which we certainly won't have when there's climate collapse and when there's not even anything growing anymore which we could eat. I think that would hurt our economy more. But the thing is that always there's this must. As Hannah Arendt noted, the greatest crimes in history have been done in the name of necessity. So they have been done because of a must. Because people convince themselves that they are not free, that what they are doing is somehow necessary. And here we can note that learning to appreciate beauty can set us free. If we give ourselves space and time, that is when we can appreciate beauty. Think once again of these former classmates that I mentioned in the lecture of beauty. They were not free. If I'm waiting there at the bridge, but I'm eager to get somewhere else, if I have an urgent appointment or whatever, if I'm stressing, if I'm not giving myself time, I cannot appreciate the sunset above the bridge. It is freedom to be able to have the time to take a break, to not have to cross the bridge right away, to not have to go to my appointment right away, but to be able to stand there for 5 minutes and look at the sunset. And likewise, that other guy I mentioned, who in school couldn't appreciate flowers because flowers were gay. Clearly he was a slave of his peers, of some stupid concepts of what is gay, what is cool, what a boy is supposed to be like, and those stupid concepts prevented him from just being able to enjoy looking at a flower. This is what I will add to what I said earlier. Yeah, sure, people are driven. People are slaves of their drives, of their desires. But the way it is now, we can't even say that they are really following their sensual desires most of the time. But rather they are following some stupid concepts they have in their head. It is not even the case that what they are doing actually is just pure hedonism and at least satisfies them on a primitive animalistic level. Like, I mean, if they were eating and drinking and fucking, that would at least be something. But such desires as being cool and not gay, or such desires as having an expensive diamond ring, or wearing clothes of a certain brand, or making a career. I mean, a natural human being, not an aufklärt one even, just a natural human being. Like, if you imagine someone from the Stone Age, someone from some tribe, he wouldn't have such desires. He wouldn't know why that diamond is supposed to be so important, or he wouldn't know what a career is supposed to be, or why this clothing, which warms you just as well as this other clothing, is somehow better because there's a brand behind it. So these desires, they're just artificial. They're just created by the society you live in. And if you are so unaufklärt, if you can't think for yourself, if you just let others dictate what you need, what you should desire, then you will be the slave of those desires. And again, beauty can liberate us. Beauty can set us free. Beauty can allow us to give ourselves time and space to just look at something and just appreciate it, independently of what we might desire, independently of what might drive us. But the thing is that finding something beautiful doesn't just liberate us, it also liberates that object which we find beautiful. That's why I use the sheep as an example. As long as the farmer looks at the sheep with the gaze of, how can I benefit from this sheep? Can I sell its wool? Can I eat its meat? The sheep is not free. The sheep is an object serving that farmer's interest. But if the farmer or the shepherd looks at the sheep and just finds it beautiful, so he just enjoys looking at the form this sheep has, the shape it has in space, the way the sheep is standing there on the grass, maybe eating the grass, maybe walking around, then he lets the sheep be. In that moment, he doesn't want anything from the sheep. He doesn't want to take its wool or its meat. He just lets it be as it is. And that means that his relationship to the sheep is somewhat similar to a moral relationship. Because that is the remarkable, the outstanding thing even, when it comes to this particular part of Kant's philosophy. And I find that by most people reading Kant and talking about Kant, most academics, this has not been noted and emphasized enough. Usually, Kant's philosophy seems to be quite clear and quite rigorous about the fact that only rational beings are free. And only rational beings are persons. Everything else is a thing to Kant. Even if it lives, even if it feels and moves like an animal, it is still, in moral terms, a thing. Only rational beings are free persons, and morality is just about them. We ought to have reverence for rational beings, for free beings, and that reverence is about revering their freedom, letting them be free. So, not subjecting them to our interests, but accepting that they don't just serve my purposes, they are a purpose, they are an end in themselves. Again, I will discuss this further in future lectures coming soon. But other things, the actual things, the things of nature which are not free, they can be used for our interests. That is what Kant's moral philosophy says. That is what he basically says in his critique of practical reason. But now comes along this critique of the power of judgment, the third of his three critiques, where he talks about beauty. And here things sound somewhat different. Because, sure, it is only my moral duty to have reverence to have regard for a free being. The sheep or a flower or a tree or whatever, anything in nature is not free. I don't have to pay reverence to it. But when I find it beautiful, it is as if I do. It is not free, it has no free will, but I treat it, I look at it as if it was free. So it is as if I had a moral relationship to it. Free beings are their own purpose. They don't just serve my purpose. And here, when I find something beautiful, even something which is not free, I treat it as if it had its own purpose. As if it was not there just for me. That is really the remarkable thing, that here Kant is able to, he's not contradicting his own philosophy, but he is still in a way going beyond the strict bounds of it, while still staying true to it. And this is a sort of relationship to nature, this treating it as if it was a moral being towards which we had the duty to regard it, to revere it, treating it as if it was free and they are not just for us but for itself. This is a relationship to nature that we should cultivate again. And you could say that in a way this is a religious relationship, because that is what religion has been about. And when I say religion, the problem is nowadays when you say religion, people tend to think of those expressions of the phenomenon that is religion, which nowadays are most prominent and most well known, like Christianity. But we must realize that this is a very, very late form of religion, and not necessarily a very typical form, even if it may have taken over, almost completely taken over all the other forms. But no, go back to older forms, go back to tribal religion, go back to the religion our first ancestors may have had. The thing here is that religion is about the holy. And unlike the profane, you cannot just use the holy and subject it to your interests. The holy needs to be revered. The holy has its own inner value. It doesn't just have value by virtue of being useful to you. So, if you believe that in every tree there is a dryad, a spirit, you're not just going to cut down the whole forest. If you believe that every bison has its own spirit, and maybe it's even your spirit animal, your totem, you're probably not going to, just for the fun of it, shoot out of a train that goes through the plains, randomly shoot at a herd of bison, as became a thing in America when the trains were built. If you believe that in nature there live spirits, there live gods, there live jinn, there live kami, however you want to call them, you will have a certain reverence for nature. You might take some parts of nature, but probably not everything. You will probably treat taking something from nature as a very serious act, as a sort of transgression that must be compensated, or from which you must first ask permission. This is what Bataille in his theory of religion discussed. To him, that is what sacrifice is about. Sacrifice means making something holy. So Saka is holy, that's where we get sacred from, and Faka is to make. So the sacrifice makes something holy, which previously has been profane. So let's say you are hunting a herd of bison. By hunting them, by killing them for their meat, for their fur, you're objectifying them. you are saying they exist for us. But people in earlier ages seem to have felt that on some level this is wrong. They are not there for us. They are there for themselves, and we are therefore committing a crime by objectifying them, by profaning what should be holy. And so Bataille says, if you now sacrifice one of the bison, like if you burn it, you destroy it as an object. You make it useless for yourself. It now can't be used for yourself anymore, but thereby you sort of set it free again. You sort of make it holy again. So to him, the sacrifice is not some cheap trade with the gods. I sacrifice this bison or this ox, so you will send rain. That is something that will come much, much later. But in its earliest form, the sacrifice is about turning that which we turned into a profane object, into an instrument for us, turning it back into something holy, into something which exists for itself. I can't go deeper into that here because this is not a Bataille lecture. I would like to give those at some point in some years maybe, but for now I'm talking about Kant. But this is an older religious relationship that we had to the world. But then, as Max Weber put it, there has been a disenchantment of the world, right? Nowadays, we don't believe anymore in these spirits that live in nature. And many people will see this as progress. Many people will see these older beliefs as superstition. But the question is, how much of a progress can it really be if what it led to is the complete exploitation and destruction of nature? It might be wrong from a scientific, materialistic standpoint to believe that there are dryads in the trees. But the moment you stop believing it, the moment you start saying, no, those trees are just large pieces of wood that can be used to burn and make fire or to build a house with or whatever, then there's nothing really stopping you from cutting down the whole rainforest to create land to plant soy, to feed animals to eat or whatever. So I would say that we need to go back to having this sort of religious reverence for nature. And of course, by this I don't mean going back to the specific myth that might have existed and that might have been believed at some point. I'm not saying we should believe again that there's a spirit in the tree, so that we can't cut down the tree, or that we should believe there's a spirit in the river, so we can't pollute and poison the river. No, we cannot just turn back the clock. These beliefs have died out. They cannot just come back. And even if they could, I'm not saying this is what should happen. I'm talking about the posture behind that belief. I mean, that belief, that myth, is really just an expression of how we approach nature. And I think we can approach nature in that way even without believing in that specific myth. And I have grounds to think so because I know that it is possible. I know so from myself, I know so from my dad, I know so from friends of mine. You can have reverence and a sort of regard for nature, a sort of religious appreciation for it, which will make you not carelessly exploit and destroy it. I mean, this is what, in Kant's day, towards the end of his life, the movement of Romanticism was about, right? Nowadays, they often get depicted as being at odds with Aufklärung, being the opposite of Aufklärung. But this is just because nowadays there is no real understanding what Aufklärung is. This is because nowadays Aufklärung is confused with Ausklärung, with this half-Aufklärung, this superficial, materialistic, relativistic believing in nothing, negative Aufklärung. To be sure, that was something which the Romanticists rejected and rebelled against, but not in the name of obscurantism, so not in the name of darkening, of anti-Aufklärung. They didn't just want to go back before Aufklärung. They themselves held aufklärt ideals. They themselves, in a way, had an aufklärt posture, at least to some degree. Rather than rejecting Aufklärung, they rejected a certain one-sided and superficial understanding of it, and they wanted to sort of deepen it and radicalize it and further develop it in a way. And they were fighting precisely this disenchantment of nature. And Romanticism too would deserve its own lectures, so I don't want to go into that too deeply. I just want to point out that in Kant, the arch-rationalist and arch-Aufklärer Kant, is not at odds with this movement per se. In fact, his critique of the power of judgment was very important and very influential on the thinkers that came after him, like Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and on the poets and writers of the time, like Schiller or Goethe, and especially on the Romantic poets, which were also influenced by the named thinkers, on Romantic poets like Novalis or Tieck or Schlegel. Their generation was influenced by the critique of the power of judgment, where Kant talks about nature and the purpose in nature and about the beautiful. And of course, what I call this religious reverence for nature cannot be our only relationship to nature. Of course, we must, and even religious people of old did, we must to some degree use nature. I mean, else we would starve and freeze. But we must not use it carelessly and mindlessly and with disregard, and we must not use it up completely. And for a very long time, there was a sort of understanding for that, expressed in myths or in some superstitions, that if you pick the apples from a tree, you have to leave the last 3 apples for the spirits. Or when you reap a field, when you reap the wheat in a field, you must leave some wheat growing in a corner and not reap it again for the spirits. In such superstitions, there was still expressed this sense that nature is not just for us. Even where we do use it for us, we have to remember that nature is more than just that. Nature is also there for itself, or at least ought to be treated as such. And here I want to express a thought that I think follows from Kant's theory of beauty, and that is that in nature everything must be beautiful. Now, Kant himself doesn't go that far, he doesn't outright say that. There are some remarks of his which at least point in that direction in a way. So one remark seems to say that even the ugly in nature, so Kant says there is ugly, yes, but even the ugly in nature is part of the whole of nature, and is what makes the whole, and therefore is part of the overall beauty of nature. He says, the limitlessness of creation contains within itself, with equal necessity, all natures which its superbly fecund richness produces, from the most refined classes of thinking beings right down to the most despicable insect. No link is irrelevant to nature, and not a single one can fail to appear without in the process fracturing the beauty of the whole, which consists in the interrelatedness. Another thought of his, pointing in the direction of everything being beautiful, is that Kant emphasizes it's not the object that's beautiful, it's our representation of that object. I talked about in the lecture on beauty about how Kant is an idealist and not a realist of purposiveness. How he says that in beauty it's not as if nature graces us by being beautiful, but rather we grace nature by looking at it as something beautiful. But if it is not the object, but rather our representation that is beautiful, then that would mean that even of an object which at first might not seem beautiful to us, we could maybe have a beautiful representation, because Kant does say that you can have a beautiful representation of a repulsive object. And this is what happens in art, right? Art can make beautiful even things that in real life probably wouldn't. Like take war, take a battle. In real life, you probably wouldn't want to be in the middle of a battlefield. But a painting of a battlefield or an epic poem about a battle could still be something which we might enjoy, because it gives us a representation of that thing, but allows us to just look at it and just appreciate its form and the purposiveness of its form, while our interests don't play into it. While, of course, if I was at the actual battlefield, I would have a negative interest. I would want to get away because I want to keep being alive. So here again, by the way, you can see how beauty liberates us, right? Art can sort of liberate us from our own drives, because it makes it easier to have this disinterested look and to make this disinterested judgment. Something which I might be interested in if I was real, whether it's a positive or negative interest, might not interest me. And therefore, I might be able to just appreciate its form when it is depicted in art. But if that is the case, I think it should follow that even without art, it might be possible to have a beautiful representation of something, even if that something is something that otherwise would drive me away and repulse me. It is just a matter of how aufklärt I am, of how much I can and how easily I can abstract from my own interests, from my own desires. Through art, this might be easier. Art might help me. But still, even without art, I should be able to, so to say, be my own artist in my mind, to give, well, to have a beautiful representation of something. And the point here is the artist, when he makes something beautiful, which we otherwise wouldn't find beautiful, does not do so by lying. He does not do so by depicting it in another form and not the form it really has. I mean, if he were to do that, then we couldn't say that he made it beautiful. Rather, he just changed it into something else, which already is beautiful. No, the artist really just liberates us from our interests, from our desires, by maybe depicting the thing as it is in its true form, but depicting it, giving us a picture of it rather than the real thing. But to me, it would follow that even with the real thing, I could potentially be able to look at it as if it was a picture, to look at it abstracted from my interests. But what Kant himself says about this thought aside, why do I say that everything in nature must be beautiful? Well, as I explained in the lecture on beauty, the beautiful is that which to us in its form is purposive. I said in that other lecture that the beautiful is that which, whether that's the case or not doesn't matter, but which seems to have been created by an intellect like mine. The beautiful is that in which I seem to recognize the handprint, the signature, so to say, of an intellectual, a rational creator. Well, if you actually are a theist, if you believe in some sort of creator god, then if you ask me, you must believe that everything in nature is beautiful, because everything was created by God. To say that there's a single ugly thing in the world would be blasphemy of the highest order. It would be something that only an atheist could say, but not a truly religious person. Because if there is a single ugly thing, then either that thing was not created by God, so now there's something else besides God, or otherwise it was created by God, but then God is not really God. Then God is not the good, the perfect, the eternal. By the way, the Quran says as much. It actually says at some point that God has made beautiful everything which he created. But even if we take the idea of God aside, and if we just go with Kant's own philosophy, well, again, the beautiful is that which is purposive to my faculty of cognition. But now consider Kant's transcendental idealism, which I discussed and described in its own lecture. I mean, Kant's whole theoretical philosophy, Kant's whole critique of pure reason, leads to the insight that the world that appears to us is just that, an appearance. It is not the thing in itself which I perceive and which I experience, but rather it is the thing as it appears to me. And how does it appear to me? In the forms that my faculty of cognition gives to it. In the 2 forms of viewing I have, time and space, and in the 12 forms of thinking I have, the 12 categories of my intellect. Both of which I discussed in previous lectures, the lecture on sensuality and the lecture on the table of categories. Well, if you ask me, that alone, even if Kant maybe didn't reflect on that and didn't fully realize that, but that alone should mean that everything must be beautiful. If you accept both his theory of beauty and his transcendental idealism, then everything must be beautiful. Because everything which appears to me must be purposive to my faculty of cognition. If it wasn't, it couldn't appear to me. I mean, if you were a transcendental realist, if you believed you were actually viewing things in themselves, then I could understand how you could claim some of them might be ugly, because there's no reason why the things in themselves should conform to my faculty of cognition. I could imagine a thing in itself being made in a way that makes it difficult or even impossible for me to really cognize it, to really experience it. But I'm not dealing with the things in themselves. I am dealing with the things that appear to me. And simply by virtue of being my appearances, being my representations, not something outside of me and independent of me, they must fit into my faculty of cognition. But fitting into my faculty of cognition is basically what beauty is about. So therefore, everything in nature should be beautiful if I just look at it the right way. That is, in a disinterested way. In an aufklärt way that has risen above its own sensual desires. I would therefore claim it follows from Kant that in nature everything must be beautiful. He himself, as I said, doesn't go quite as far. In fact, he makes the remark at some points that the things that are useful to us tend to be less beautiful. Like he would say that useful plants, such as wheat, are less beautiful than useless plants, such as roses. Or useful animals, such as cows or donkeys, he says, are less beautiful compared to more useless animals like peacocks or butterflies or whatever. And I think that's an interesting thought, that nature made the useful things less beautiful. And it might be true in a way, but I wouldn't say that wheat or a cow are not beautiful. If anything, I would just say that it is a little harder to discover their beauty. A rose may be more obviously and more immediately beautiful to us, while maybe a cow requires more disinterested contemplation. But maybe that is precisely because of its usefulness, because we are more used to look at it, even if unconsciously, with a gaze, with a view into which interested is mixed in. And maybe the useful makes it a bit harder for us to abstract from our interests. But if we look at nature completely disinterested, my claim is that everything in nature must be beautiful. And the ugly, I would say, can only exist in human beings and in that which was created by human beings. Because human beings alone, since they are free, can estrange themselves from themselves. Human beings alone can, so to say, estrange themselves from their own soul, from God. Human beings alone can be disconnected. Just like because of their freedom, only human beings can be evil, so in their actions, they can act in a non-purposive way. They can create disharmony in action instead of acting in a harmonious, purposive way. Just like that, when it comes to beauty, human beings alone are capable of, well, creating the ugly. That goes for human beings themselves. Like, I never understood how some animals can be ugly. Even if I get shown a picture of what is supposed to be the most ugly dog in the world, or what is supposed to be an ugly animal species, I never could bring myself to find them ugly. They are still purposive in their form. But if I see certain human beings who are evil and have evilness written in their face, then even if they are not deformed, I do find them ugly. And that also goes for what humans create. What nature created, I always find beautiful. But humans, of course, are able to create ugly things. Like, look at modern architecture, look at those soulless blocks of concrete and glass. They are clearly ugly. Or look at certain clothes, certain fashions. Clearly, they are ugly. But they are ugly because the people who made them are ugly. And the people who desire them, who want them, who appreciate them, are ugly on the inside. Wherever there's no freedom and wherever there's evil, sure, you will also find the ugly. You will also find a lack of taste. I already previously talked about this. I mean, just look at the soulless, brutalistic architecture in North Korea, or these gigantic building projects in Arab countries, and or look at the complete tastelessness of these show-off influencers or reality TV stars. So sure, humans can produce extremely ugly things, and there's probably no way to look at them and find them beautiful. But when it comes to nature, everything can be beautiful. And that is why I want to close this off with giving you an exercise. Let's call it a meditative exercise. Try to look at nature and to find it beautiful. Pick something, pick some object, look at it, and discover its beauty. And don't just do this once and with one object, do it with several objects. And don't make it too easy for yourself. Don't just pick a rose and appreciate the rose's beauty. Pick something which is maybe not so beautiful for you at first, but more boring and neutral, like a piece of moss or a stone. Or even pick something which you might find ugly or disgusting to some degree, like a spider or a maggot. If you want to make it easier for yourself, if you want to practice step by step, you can start maybe with the rose and then go to the stone or the moss and then go to the spider. But try to eventually get to a point where you can appreciate the beauty even in the spider. This will require you to just contemplate, to just look at the thing's form and just discover how wonderfully purposive it is. Abstract from your interests you might have. Abstract from the fact that this thing, like the moss, might not be of interest to you. You don't get anything out of it. Or abstract from the fact that something like the spider maybe is even of negative interest to you. You don't like it. Abstract from that, just look at the picture of it and just discover how purposive its form is. And this is, on one hand, a thinking exercise, I would say, because it teaches us to look at something and to appreciate looking at something, having cognition of something, to appreciate when we discover something. It also teaches us looking in a disinterested way. So in a way, it teaches objectivity. If we go with Nietzsche's definition, that objectivity means having your for and against with yourself, meaning you are not the slave of your interests, of having to immediately applaud something or boo something, but rather being able to put your yes or no aside for a moment and to just look at something. This sort of objectivity is something that you can train that way. But also it is something that sets you and that sets the nature that you're looking at free. And therefore it is something that should have a moral effect. If we learn to appreciate something for its own sake, not just because it can serve us in some way, if we learn to realize how purposive something is, we will find another sort of appreciation for it. Kant himself says as much at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason, where he says, "For we ultimately take a liking for a thing, the contemplation of which makes us feel that the use of our cognitive faculties is extended. And this extension is especially furthered by that in which we find moral correctness, since it is only in such an order of things that reason, with its faculty of determining a priori on principle what ought to be done, can find satisfaction. An observer of nature takes liking at last to objects that at first offended his senses, when he discovers in them the great adaptation of their organization to design, so that his reason finds food in its contemplation. So Leibniz spared an insect that he had carefully examined with the microscope, and replaced it on his sleeve, because he had found himself instructed by the view of it, and had, as it were, received a benefit from it. And this is exactly the view of nature we need to practice. This is what we need nowadays in the time of the ecological crisis. I mean, if you find a house beautiful, you will not just tear it down to build a parking garage on it. And if you find a tree or a whole forest beautiful, then too, you will not just cut the trees down to burn all the wood and to build a soy field on top of it. So if, like Leibniz learned to appreciate that bug, that insect, we learn to appreciate nature again, or maybe even for the first time, independently of what it can do for us, how it can be there for us and used by us, then we would also start being more careful with nature and not destroy it carelessly when it is maybe not necessary. And this is what I think we can take away and learn from Kant's theory of beauty. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufkläring cause.